yesterday we were talking very much about multilateralism from an African perspective, the past, the present as it's viewed from Europe and from Africa, and with a brief intervention on China. Today we're looking at multilateralism 2.0. Where do we go from here? How might we understand multilateralism in the future? And again, we have an African perspective. We're going to have a fuller Chinese perspective this morning. We'll actually conclude with a Canadian perspective.
The outline of my talk. Basically, the main message I want to convey to you today is that if we think about not only multilateralism, but something related to that, and we can discuss it, it's global governance, we urgently need some social innovations. And I'm going to try to make the case for that in a very simple structure of the talk. I will speak about the past, the present, and the future. I indeed wrote a little piece for the journal Global Policy with the title Multilateralism 2.0, and I used that phrase. Well, 2.0 is actually kind of a catchword that people can use whenever they want to talk about something that is kind of quantum leap, about reinventing of whatever fashionable word you want to use. I mean, everybody knows the origins in software development. We all have been working with Windows 3.1 and then it became, I don't know, 3.3 or something like that. What are the basic principles of multilateralism? As we all know, it's a system that is dominated by sovereign states. We talk mostly about intergovernmentalism. At least we talk about state-centered. There is, as I already mentioned, the way it functions today, there are these two separate worlds of economic and political governance. Today, within the UN, we have a very limited space for regional governance. Because indeed, when you talk about multilateralism, the idea that you bring together more than 3 states is the classical definition, I believe, to do things together. That can be done with a global vision, with the ideal of bringing together all the states in the world, or you can do that at a more regional level, where you only bring together a number of neighboring states. Trying to manage relations between states so that war was excluded was the main issue of the United Nations in that year, and it remains so for a number of years. We are done with the bipolarity of the Cold War, and today the catchword, especially in academia, is multipolarity. There are different opinions on what exactly it means, but we can see indeed that some new emerging powers, the BRICS, not to call them, have their own views about what is governance, what is global governance, both in the political sphere and the economic sphere. There is a problem with multilateralism, obviously, and part of that problem is that the institutions, the mechanisms that we have today are just not fit for purpose to deal with global governance. The weak multilateralism that we see today is reflected in weak global governance. And Pascal Lamy made the following analysis very quickly. He said, first of all, we have a problem of leadership, and the question is, who is there to embody a vision of global governance, something that people all over the world can say, yes, this is what we want to fight for. Secondly, there is the issue of capacity to mobilize resources and deploy them. Efficiency is a major issue for global governance, and especially for the functioning of the United Nations system. 3, there is the issue or the question how to achieve coherence. We have a very complex landscape of international organizations now, even within the United Nations. And hence, for a couple of years now, there is this mantra of one UN, and all of the people within the UN are urged to work more together. But at the end of the day, you still see that because it's a bureaucracy, it's still very compartmentalized. And then finally, and perhaps the most important issue, how to achieve legitimacy for global governance. We need to find mechanisms to bring the concerns, the local concerns and the global concerns of people at the level of global institutions. And I think social media can play an important role here. When I came up with this concept of multilateralism 2.0, I wanted to find a kind of vignette label that expresses two reforms that I believe that are necessary. First of all, we should go, if we want a more effective global governance, etc., my claim, and this is a more political claim than a scientific claim, but my claim is that we have to change membership of multilateral organizations. This brings me to the second issue, the organizational level. I think that we see it in national governments already. There have been reforms of the way governments work in most countries all over the world. And we need the same kind of change in the multilateral organizations. Basically, it's moving away from the purely bureaucratic system to a more fluid, networked system. And my claim is that if you look carefully, you can see today a number of signals that are witnesses of the birth of multilateralism 2.0. What are these signs? I already mentioned some of them. First of all, there is a diversification of multilateral organizations. We have already about more than 400 organizations that would qualify as multilateral, especially, as I mentioned already, at the regional level. And we can see that while, for instance, the number of states now is more or less stabilizing, the number of regional integrations is still going up. Secondly, we have a growing importance of non-state actors. 3, we witness a growing of transnational policy networks. Finally, there is a growing space for citizens. We have seen what happened in Seattle, Occupy Wall Street, the Indignados, etc. There is a growing need, I think, to accommodate the concerns of people with global governance. Very quickly, the 4 scenarios. The first one is where you combine unipolarity with cosmopolitan values and an influence of non-state. Now it's the second one. The unipolarity with inward-looking societies would, in my view, I can discuss this more or less at the end of multilateralism 2.0. The third one, the fragmented multipolarity, I like to call it also the Orwellian scenario, where you have regional blocs, very close poles themselves. And finally, there is the open regionalism, which was the one favored by quite a lot of the researchers, where you have a multipolarity that is organized at a regional level, where there is room for non-state actors, such as megacities, but where an important role is played by regional organizations. And here we were thinking about a kind of regional-driven United Nations. From my perspective, one, I think it's clear that we need new and even more global governance. But 2, the point I want to make is that the current structures need to adapt, but there is a lot of resistance. And this is why in my scenario exercise and in the way that I think about multilateralism 2.0, I always come back to regions. Not because I think the world is going to be saved by the regional organizations, but because this is an avenue of possible reform. The second innovation, and I will end with that, is that I really think we should increase the fora function of multilateral organizations and make sure that they can be spaces of dialogue between civil society and all kinds of other actors.
Maybe I would like to go back maybe to what was being said yesterday. We are talking so much about multilateral as if bilateral does not exist in that context, because I think it is the state that chooses to take certain issues at a bilateral level or move them at a multilateral level, depending on the type of issues that are being discussed. Some of them you can deal with them at a bilateral level, or you move on a bilateral level. Once you have agreement, then you go to a multilateral level and have another agreement. So the two do not exclude each other. See, that's an important element, because the way we are talking as if the bilateral has been on the side, or we don't do it, but even when you go to a multilateral conference, okay, it is on the sideline so much of the bilateral be able to get an agreement. I think that should be taken into consideration. And I think what has happened that if global governance in 1945 was much more political and economic in terms of either you have peace and security, and whether you have economic, not economic balance, but it was trying to save Europe. How do you save Europe? And you have a good trading pattern. That was part of the American understanding. How do I save Europe? Okay, and I prevent communism. So there are two elements of the economic and the political. How do I prevent war? And how do I gain in terms of economic stability? When we are talking multilateralism, you have to look at it at a three level. There is the global level, the regional level, and sub-regional level. If you take the African countries, the small countries with 5 million people, 20 million people, and we needed something which we can fight these big groups, the European group. We needed something. We could not go there as a country and talk about this and that. We needed to have a backing, okay, of the group. Okay, the weak normally fight as a group. Okay, so we did not have neither the military power nor the economic power to be able to do so. So we needed the regional backing to be able to speak, as they were saying, in the same voice. Our expectations were two. One was economic, okay, that we are trying to leverage something for the rest of the world to be able to get investments and so on. We should not be surprised to say we still need investments and aid. That's the reality of the situation. But also, the other expectation was political changes. We expected that by being part of the global, of the bigger world, we might be able to get certain supports. Okay, even if you go back to the United Nations, the new international economic order, that was what we were fighting for. Please, 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 hey, let's change the rules of the game. Okay, let's change the trade, let's change this, let's change that. We were expecting some support, and we thought by playing around at the multilateral level, we'd be able to gain certain leverages. Now, we might have been disappointed because we did not get all those things, and after 50 years of independence, of which I've been watching around, I think some of us are a little bit disappointed. I don't want to go too much there. Thank you very much.
We in South Africa, at least, are very much in favor of a much wider participation in multilateralism to include a very wide spectrum of non-state actors. In fact, the habit in South Africa is when we do go to multilateral meetings, particularly supra-regional, sub-regional, even in AU context, even in the global climate change conferences, we always ensure that we take our non-state actors with. And it's increasingly to us important that we have that participation. It's the only way that you can really ensure that multilateralism take the complexities of modern societies into account when decisions are made. When Ambassador Mhlapo yesterday made his presentation, he made a clear reference to at least the African perspective, and that is we expect some form of equality in participation. I think he called it equal sovereignty. And that is a clear difference in approach to participation in multilateral fora at all levels. There's a certain feeling that powerful nations resent outcomes that do not support their preferred outcomes. This is at least our perspective. There's a feeling that there are suspicions about the supranational organizations and their participation. I think here particularly of BRICS or IPSA or some of these organizations, that these weaker nations, now I'm not calling all the BRICS nations weaker nations, but they come and scramble the deck. They ensure that we don't get the outcome. In fact, you're imposing a solution that is so-called democratic, but it's not a long-term solution. And we're looking at getting a long-term solution. One of the fundamental approaches of South Africa within AU context is that we're very afraid or very careful not to be seen as a hegemon. You know, statistics in terms of economic power, in terms of possible political influence, favor South Africa very much. Might not last very long. I understand Egypt, Nigeria, etc. are growing at a rapid pace, although they face their own political problems at the moment. But in fact, it could put us into a situation like the United States is viewed in Latin America. I served for 6 years in Brazil, and I know what they felt like about the US. We are very, very aware that we should not be seen as such. Often then, South Africa is being criticized that you should take a more firm leadership role that comes from outside. I can assure you, as one state, with our approach to multilateralism of equal sovereignty, we will not do that. What we will do is to ensure that we have a better influence in the bureaucracy at the AU, where we can convince rather than playing that hegemonic role. One last note, and that is that the AU is now 10 years old, more or less. The EU is 50 years old. We know the difficulties that the EU faces, particularly currently. Please give us time to capacitate ourselves and stop throwing stones. Thank you.
While the European Union has the rights to speak in European Union, and other non-state actor cannot have the right to speak in the United Nations General Assembly, because the European Union is more like supranational organizations. That means European Union is more like a state, or it can represent the rights of its members. So, so the European Union is like a federal state's central government. It's more like the central government of a federal state. So it's more, it has more rights in the European Union. So if we can imagine if the European Union does not is not like is not more like a supranational organizations. I think it will be a nice rights of speaking in the European Union General Assembly. So when the European Union will be the full participant in the United Nations, has voting rights, I predict when the European Union becomes a federal state, all the United Nations become a non-NGO. So the first opinion generally, I think the non-state as a player in the United Nations, in the intergovernmental or governmental multilateral organizations is not a case. But in reality, some newcomers, new participants will benefit from the old order in the multilateral institutions. But with the pass of time, with the divergence of polarity, the maintenance of old order will be more difficult. So I agree with the multipolarization in the multilateral arrangements is a case, but this tendency will finally change the old order. In my opinion, the good governance is a kind of multilateralism. That means good governance cannot avoid the multilateralism. But the multilateralism maybe is not a good governance. For example, the IMF is a multilateral institution, but this is not a good governance, because good governance has many features such as transparency of decision making and the legitimacy and so on. So this is a relation between multilateralism and good governance. The fourth opinion about the future of the multilateralism. It's rising or declining. I think the better answer is not rising or declining, just the evolution. There is a declining of the multilateralism. If you say this is a declining, because in the for the core of the globalization, it has another phase, that is a fragmentation. So that means the actors in the international society have so many difficult interests. Their interests, thank you. The interests are competed. So this means the fragmentation make the multilateralism less efficient. I think because according to the globalization and the fragmentation, they exist together. So I think the declining or rising will also be existed together. I think it's better to call this change the evolution, and because I think in reality most states take the selective or pragmatic multilateralism, not the pure multilateralism. So I think this tendency has nothing to do with rising or declining, but some evolution. Second style may be simply dominated by or controlled or led by the big powers, by the hegemonic powers. But this, with the rising of the emerging states, I think this state is changed. So, of course, this is also reality to some degree. The third style is elite states guided multilateralism, acquired its the elitist multilateralism. The difference is the former elitist multilateralism is based on coordination, consultation, and competition. Because the competition means the core players in the multilateralism is open for all the members, so the core players can change with the change of the situation. The last feasible style of multilateralism is maybe a mixed multilateralism. It means the coexistence of all other styles. I think maybe the last one is much more feasible in the future. That's my opinion. Thank you.
I'm a Canadian who's been living in Europe for 10 years, but I'm an optimist when it comes to multilateralism, even after working on Mercury for 3 years. And even seeing the EU, who's, especially maybe after, and the EU, of course, sometimes hasn't been a great success story when it's tried to deliver on multilateralism, but I still think that, there is hope for multilateralism. Let's hope that we don't need another world conflict or world war to come back and have to build a new system. I mean, there are things that work. Let's focus on that and see why it works. And so that's my little there. There's clearly a demand that, for multilateralism is on the rise. We see this with the G20, and we see that it's dealing with a multitude of issues. It used to be the more traditional trade and security, but we see now for energy, climate change, migration, even linking trade and climate change. So there's definitely a demand for it. What we've been hearing is that now Western powers are demanding more of developing nations in multilateralism. So it's not only, some states saying, the great powers don't want to do it, we'll go on our own, but it's Western powers saying to developing nations, you want to be part of the system, we're going to demand more of you now, which I think is a very interesting kind of trend that we're seeing. If you have these new actors that are in a position of power that is kind of different, and are trying to affect the reforms and the things like that, and I think it's going to be interesting to see research kind of focusing on that and how they're affecting. We've been focusing on the EU for 3 years, but I think there should be other research projects that kind of look at how they're trying to, their strategies in achieving. I think that's another thing that should be for a new research agenda. Because sometimes the EU is struggling. Even when we were discussing the UN Security Council yesterday reform, the EU as a regional organization is not able to kind of lead. Even, if the AU would want the EU to kind of push that because it doesn't have a single voice on that issue. So I think it's interesting to look at other regional organizations and how they might also intervene in the debate. So it's interesting to see that between the regional organization, there's definitely, some power kind of, relation that's going on. And also, they said basically we're small states, we don't have the power of the EU. What is it going to mean for us? And I think that's really interesting to see the relationship. The African Union, the Arab League, didn't have a clear position at the beginning. Pretty quickly kind of supported because it would set a precedent for them to get right. But I think it's an interesting kind of debate. In the end, they did get the speaking rights, but they had to negotiate, they had to go, and CARICOM, like a small organization, was able to kind of, and really reiterate the point that, the UN is a state-based organization. Really didn't want to extend this kind of regional, and that coming from a regional organization. You want to involve civil society, but how do you do it? What's the most effective way to do it? I think that's another. And I guess the last thing I would say is that when you look at the future of multilateralism, you have to acknowledge that there are different understandings of multilateralism, different meanings. And I think we've heard this the last 2 days, that when you say multilateralism for an African or Chinese, or there are different meanings. So I'm not sure there would be a multilateralism 2.0, but it might be a multilateralism 1.1.1, kind of different meaning of that. And I think when you talk about the future and where it's going, you really need to acknowledge these different meanings. If you're negotiating with your partners, you might need to recognize that you might have a different understanding of what you mean by multilateralism. Thank you.
My presentation today has more to do with my regular position at Apr. I'm heading the program on military expenditure and arms production, which is a very empirical program. The projects in the program are engaged in data collection and analyzing the trends and developments annually, and this is presented in the Apr yearbook. I don't know if you are familiar with that. Civil society organizations in 40 countries across the world are engaged in something called the Global Day of Action on Military Spending, where they have different types of campaigns with the objective to reduce military spending and initiate a debate on the cost of the military sector, the reasons for that, and the competing demands on the public sector. So the title of my presentation today is African Military Expenditure in a Global Context. It consists of primarily two parts. First, I will present the standard survey of trends and developments in world and regional military expenditure based on this new data, which covers the period up to 2011. And second, I will zoom in on African military spending. And finally, I will present some issues related to military expenditure in order to try to inspire your reflections on the data and the trends that I'm presenting from a multilateral perspective. Out of these, we cover data for 51 countries in Africa, not all the 54 again, 47 of which in sub-Saharan Africa and 4 in North Africa. We define Egypt as Middle East, so Egypt is not part of the Africa data at Apr. And I will mention also already now African military spending in 2011, which amounted to $34 billion, which means that Africa accounts for only 2% of world military spending. The picture is very mixed in Africa, with half of African countries increasing and half decreasing. Based on current decisions and or likely trends in major spender countries, it looks as if world military spending will not increase during the next few years. Here we can see that world military expenditure is very much influenced by the spending of a few countries. The top 5 military spenders are, guess who? It's the 5 permanent members of the United Nations. And the next 5 are Japan, Saudi Arabia, India, Germany, and Brazil. And finally, the next 5, Italy, South Korea, Australia, Canada, and Turkey. US military expenditure has been strongly influenced by the global war on terror policy launched by the Bush administration after 9/11, and which subsequently led to these wars. China accounts for 8% of world military expenditure in 2011. The increase was 6.7% in real terms, which was significant, but still slower than during the previous decade. Russia accounted for 4.1% of world military expenditure in 2011. It increased by 9.3% in real terms in 2011, which brought Russia to the 3rd place in world military expenditure, having passed, I think it was UK, or France perhaps 3 years earlier, and UK in 2011 then. And the aim is to replace 70% of the Russian inventory of major weapon systems with modern weapons. And then we have France and the UK, which accounted for 3.6% each of military expenditure in 2011. And here we can see the major spenders in sub-Saharan Africa for 2011 again. So the top 5 military spenders are South Africa, Angola, probably Sudan, although we don't have any numbers for Sudan in 2011, but based on their previous level, I included them here, because it's most likely, and Nigeria and South Sudan. Together, these 5 countries account for 71% of African military spending. So what Apr is arguing for is very much improvement in the transparency and accountability in the military sector, with the aim of setting budget priorities which are in line with the priorities of the population. Africa is the location of much armed and violent conflicts. And of course that also means that it's difficult to monitor the actual size, level and trend in military expenditure. And we are aware that military spending during a conflict is probably much larger than any official estimates.
Well, I want to start by thanking all of you, the diehards, those that stayed until the very end. A lot of other, we had about almost 70, 80 people actually that came in and out during the 2 days, which is an interesting number, a pretty good number. I'm just going to say a few words about what has been discussed over the two days. The title of this conference is Multilateralism in 21st Century, and it comes after 3 years of research that we have conducted in partnership with other universities. And it seems to me that at the beginning, John Peterson and Caroline Bouchard wrote a paper dealing with the complexity of the concept of multilateralism, and after 3 years, we have gone full circle. You know, we have stayed with the complexity of the concept of multilateralism. We have said that most of the times multilateralism is in the eye of the beholder. There are different cultural understandings of multilateralism, perceptions and practices of multilateralism within different regions and across regions. We've also discussed about the fact that for many years multilateralism has been seen more normatively as a good thing to do. More and more analysis into multilateralism has shifted the debate from the normative angle to the descriptive angle. Like multilateralism is a practice rather than necessarily a good thing in its own and in and of itself, but rather as a process that may lead to more optimal outcomes. Behind the multilateralism label, you still find issues around sovereignty, around inequality of participation. Not all participants are the same. I use the metaphor of a family dinner. You know, we're all sitting around the table, but somebody does the dishes, somebody cooks dinner, and somebody, sets the discussion. Multilateralism is a black box. There's a lot of stuff in that. Looking just at the label, looking just at the surface may not be enough. And time has come, I believe, to not just focus on the quantity of multilateralism. I think too many scholars have, sort of measure how much multilateralism do we have in the world, as if that was necessarily a good thing. I would say that more and more needs to be done in the quality of that multilateralism, in the quality of those negotiations, in the quality of interactions at the UN. Multilateralism is ineffective. Multilateralism is lengthy and can be resource intensive, but at the end of the day, it's only by getting together and deciding together that we can achieve more positive outcomes. Labels such as asymmetrical multilateralism. Irrespective of the outcome, there are asymmetries when it comes to certain decision-making processes. Do you know what this image is? Who knows what this image is? Aren't asking more. This is the friendships on Facebook. This is the connections among Facebook users as of 2 years ago. This is multilateralism 2.0. Like the idea that actually citizens can shape, processes. And we know that Facebook, just like many other social networks, has become extremely important to empower citizens and civil society to play a role at different levels. And so it would be interesting to me to see how new avenues are being used, for instance, by civil society, not just to join the clubs, but to challenge the clubs and to rethink the clubs and maybe to create alternative clubs. That would be, I think, another topic for those interested in civil society contribution to international politics.
So something was going to be passed almost unanimously, and after hours of interventions on the matter by individual senators, some staff member asked, hasn't everything possible that there is to say on this matter already been said? And the Senate Majority Leader said, yes, but not everyone has said it. There are more regional organizations, there are more NGO observers, but the system is still very highly bureaucratic and not fit for purpose to deal with global publics who are more connected to one another through Facebook and other means. So the point is, building multilateralism inevitably I'd argue, requires two things. One, a more active role for non-state actors. Again, key feature of multilateralism 2.0 is that now non-state actors are very active players in international cooperation. And the definition that Caroline and I came up with at the beginning of Mercury refers to actors, not just states. And second, building multilateralism involves a sort of sales job of the kind that Pascal Lamy is very good at. Remember, he said, you know, the four challenges to global governments: leadership, efficiency, coherence, legitimacy. More voices are needed to convince often very skeptical publics about the virtue of multilateralism. Of course, by way of analogy, being here in the new South Africa is still new, isn't it? Yeah. Well, but it's still, you know, it's clearly, crucially important for, say, the University of Pretoria to have a student body and a faculty that looks like the country at large. We know that recruitment to all international organizations, including the UN and the European Union, is to some extent politically derived. But recruitment to the African Union thus far has fallen dramatically short of any kind of notion of meritocracy, unusually so when compared to other international organizations. Let's just remember, Luke reminded us, the EU is one of the largest contributors to UN peacekeeping, so however nasty and evil and villainous the European Union is in other areas of international policy, it does a lot in that area. But the end result of multilateralism is usually some kind of compromise and some kind of suboptimal solution, which would be unimaginable in the absence of multilateral exchange. Partly for that reason, I too remain a multilateralism optimist. But I'm optimistic above all because of the very powerful functional pressures to which states and other international actors must respond out of sheer self-interest. But I live in hope. And by the way, EU behavior on UN Security Council reform has been shameful. But I live in hope that one day Europeans will be shamed into getting their act together on this and other pressing multilateral issues out of necessity and as a response to the relative decline in Europe's international power. One last time, Lorenzo, Maxi, all your Pretoria colleagues, thanks for being so beautiful and such great Facebook friends.